So quick announcement at the end of this talk, Shafi Goldwater, the director of the institute, is going to make a short announcement. So please stay back after the talk.
Very, very interesting two markets she wants to talk about and get suggestions. Two matching markets, two possible matching markets.
So yeah, it's not it's related to the theme of the workshop.
It's not an
administrative thing. So even more incentive for you guys to stay back. So over to Balu.
Okay. Thanks, Nikhil. Okay, so this is going to be a talk on open problems. That's what Nikhil wanted me to talk about. Some open problems in the display ads marketplace. These are not necessary. Not all of them are like fully fleshed out concrete math problems. I'm going to talk about practical challenges that we face in the marketplace. But I'm sure there are many problems out there that this community can solve. Okay. So these are current problems. Many of these are like real. Like we are tackling these right now. Okay, so what are the entities in the marketplace? This is a pretty messy marketplace. There are too many entities. Okay, the most important ones are the publishers. So when you say publishers, we think of like this big newspaper publishers, New York Times, Washington Post, or Gannett, but we often don't think of these app publishers, and these are actually pretty huge. Many of them are like multi-billion-dollar market cap companies, and they are completely on fire now. And there is a diversity. There is like distinction between, the regular publishers and app publishers, and that gives rise to some important problems that we're talking about today. Okay, so this is one of the big entities in the marketplace. Of course, there are advertisers, who want to maximize their ROI, reach, and scale, etc. And there are end users, and there is an awful lot of each of these. Okay, we are talking about, this is like very, very conservative, really 100+ billion page views per day, hundreds of thousands of advertisers, so many publishers. And there are so many companies out there trying to maximize metrics for all these, like relevance for users, revenue for publishers, ROI and reach and scale for advertisers. Okay. So these are sort of the main entities, but of course there are entities which represent these. So there are sell-side platforms. These are platforms which represent publishers, like many of them. Google Ad Manager is one very big one, and there are separate sell-side platforms for app publishers. For instance, Mopub, owned by Twitter, is a big platform, sell-side platform for apps. So these app publishers will get an account here, and then through the single platform, they're able to sort of completely manage all their demand sources. Right? Whoever is buying from them, where the inventory is getting sold, all the revenue, etc. Like nice reporting is being given by the sell-side platforms. Okay, and then likewise on the buy side, there are demand-side platforms which try to aggregate for a given buyer. If you're buying across several different publishers, several different exchanges, etc., you don't want to have the burden of doing this. You want a demand-side platform which will give you beautiful reporting, which will take care of bidding optimizations for you. Many advertisers don't even have the firehose to don't even have the bandwidth to take the Google firehose, for instance, and these bidding networks can do that. Like for instance, Criteo is managing more than like billion per day and so on. Right? All these are like really big. So I'll use the word demand-side platforms and ad networks interchangeably. And then there are marketplaces, which are exchanges, ad exchanges, which run some kind of auction. So whenever you visit a query, you go and visit New York Times, and then that query is sent to, let's say, Google AdX, and Google AdX sends a call out to all these bidding networks, and they have to bid. All this happens in real time. In real time, these bidding networks decide a bid, some kind of auction goes on, and then you decide the winner, the ad is impressed, and so on. This continues. Okay, let's talk about problems now. Mediation is one big problem. So mediation itself is not a problem. The problem comes in the next slide. Okay, so what exactly is mediation? Like I said, publishers are getting ads from numerous different ad sources. It's not just one ad source. It's not just Criteo or Facebook Audience Network alone that I want to get my money from. It's numerous ad sources. And unfortunately, there is not enough demand aggregation. Right? There is not a single flat auction where you could get all these ad networks to participate and get your money. If that is the case, then it's good, but we don't have it. We're slowly getting there. There is exchange bidding that Google has, but still like it's on the desktop space. On the app space, there is not enough demand aggregation. So there are so many different demand sources. And as a publisher, of course, it's better for me if there is more competition and more demand sources for the single query that I'm selling. So well, what do I do? Ideally, I would hope for this aggregation, but since it's not there, I'm going to approach these buyers in sequence, in some kind of chain, okay? And then there are companies which are providing this as a solution. So it's a mediation provider who will do the following for you as a publisher. When a query comes, you send this query to a mediation provider for you, like MoPub, for instance, provides this. This mediation provider is going to say, okay, there are all these demand sources, and I'm going to construct a chain, and then I'm going to call these like different ad networks in this order at different reserve prices, perhaps, right? The minimum bid they have to bid to win that query. All that is decided by the mediation provider. Now, there are many of them out there, and primarily adopted by app publishers because already the real-time thing is already challenging. On top of this, we are talking about like multiple back and forths here. You send it to an ad network, they run their own auction, get it back to you, and then if it fails, you go to another ad network and so on. This could go on for like 20, 30, even 50 times, right? So this causes enormous delay and this terrible experience in desktop, but for apps, it's not a problem because you're going to spend some time on the app, and I'm already fetching it, for the next 10 minutes, I'll start fetching it right now. So in apps, this delay is not a problem, and this is adopted by app publishers a lot, mediation. Okay, so what's wrong about this? This is okay. But the problem with mediation is that these mediation providers also do the following, which is that they don't call an ad network just once. The same ad network gets called multiple times for a single piece of inventory. Okay. So the same guy, and this guy there is the same eyeball you're trying to win. There is a single slot, and then you call, let's say, Google's AdMob once. Hey, do you want to win it at a price of $90 CPM, right? And then you say no, and then something happens. All this is invisible to you as AdMob. And then again, it comes at, do you want to win at $84.99, for instance? This comes back to you, same query. How do you detect it and so on? We'll come to that. This detection is a huge engineering problem. It's unclear. But, okay, so first of all, these chains can be very big, the total chain. And sometimes a single demand source itself could be called like 20 times for the same piece of inventory, typically at descending prices. Okay.
So a demand source is an ad exchange or an ad network?
You should think of it as an ad network, but it's even an ad exchange is basically, it turtles all the way down. Ad exchange, ad networks, anybody who can return an ad is good enough. Right? So an ad network or ad exchange who's registered with the mediation service provider, right? Mediation provider here will be included in this. So for instance, Google Ad Exchange, for instance, is a part of this chain. AdMob is a part of this chain. But Facebook Audience Network is not an exchange. They are a network, but still they're a part of this chain. So both exchanges and networks are part of this chain. It doesn't matter because ultimately these networks are also running some internal auctions because networks represent so many different buyers. In some sense, the difference between exchange and network gets blurred there. Maybe exchanges are bigger in scale, but the difference is blurred.
So this is called by AdX or by Google AdX or by.
This is called by MoPub, for instance. They are like constructing chains of length 50.
These are like from the publisher side then.
And the publisher can use any mediation service provider, and MoPub is one of the big ones for apps, and they construct chains like this.
The publisher typically uses a single mediation provider.
Yes, they use a single mediation provider, yes. And this is also not some corner case or some like voodoo thing like apps. This is the thing. If you're an app publisher, you're not doing this. It basically means that most of your business is from desktop and your app is like, some like afterthought or something. If you're a big app publisher, this is the thing. Most of the inventory is sold via mediation chains and multicall is involved.
Is there a phenomenon where like a mediator coming on top of other mediators? Like a mediator calling other mediators, right?
No, but the chain is executed still on the client side, right? Like the call first goes to MoPub, and then MoPub will give you a chain, and then the client, which is on your phone, let's say, and then the client has to like make a call, and then the ad has to come back. There is also response time, right? You can't in between, a mediator should not say, oh, I'll call this big chain and then come back to you, because before that response time, it will fail, and then it'll mean that call failed. It's all in your phone. Like the chain is in your phone, and then the SDKs are there.
Questions. One is, can you just explain what the colors represent here? And then the second one, what's happening that
don't quite understand how does the numbers come into play? In an auction, you don't send the numbers. You say, okay, I have a slot, bid on it, and here's there's something. I don't understand what this number is.
Very good. Okay, so I was going to say that. Very good. Okay, so first of all, the colors is nothing. It's just the same networks are in the same color, right? App loving is an ad network. It's all in the same color. Fan is Facebook audience network. Is all in red. Google AdMob is in green. The numbers there are the reserve prices that I send in the call out. So what is happening here is I am trying as a publisher or as a mediation service provider on behalf of the publisher, trying to extract whole surplus by giving a very high reserve price at first, seeing whether you win, and then I keep on going down in reserve prices, right?
Why is this not parallel? Why is this sequential?
It could also be done in parallel, but there are some restrictions on, like, if you call out to an ad network and if they return a winning ad or something, like how often you can, like, renege on this promise, right? Because they are, it's a huge cost to run this operation, and then they are returning an ad, and if you say no, that's problematic. So you can't run it, like, you can't arbitrarily call me, and every time I return an ad, 90% of the time you say no. There are some issues there.
But that's how it is in, let's say, ad exchanges, right? When you're running an auction.
No, in ad exchange it's clear, right? Because you're running an auction and somebody is winning.
Yeah, so it could be the same thing, right? Why don't you send kind of, some $95 to app loving, fan, and AdMob at the same time, rather than kind of doing one after the other? Okay, so
at least for the multi-call purposes, you have to do one after the other.
There's a protocol essentially.
Okay, so for multi-call purposes, if I have to call AdMob twice, at least you have to do sequentially. For that part, sequential or parallel, it doesn't matter. So let's not get into that. Really, the multi-call is a big part here. So the mediation, whether you do sequentially or parallel, it doesn't matter. But there are reasons why it's done sequentially. Okay, it's really because, like, if ad exchange is sitting here, right, and you called so many different exchanges. But ad exchange basically wants a guarantee, for instance, that if I'm returning an ad with a very high probability, you need to accept it because I've already run an auction. And then you can't accept it because you're also called other exchanges in parallel and you're running an auction on top of it. And therefore, you will, with a good probability, reject AdX. And that's not the way contracts are, right? But anyway, it doesn't matter whether that is parallel. Like, if you want, think about those things as in parallel. But still, app loving is getting called multiple times in sequence, which has to be in sequence by definition, with descending prices. And I'm trying to get at extracting the whole surplus in this process.
So when I see this change, and I think of it as all of these calls have happened, and in each case the reserve price was not met. And that's
yes, in each case the reserve price was not met. Otherwise, exactly, the chain will get terminated there.
So why do you lower? So I understand why you have to lower the price between two different calls to app loving. But so the first two, why don't you ask for the same $100 from fan?
You could, but also I think, like, there is a question of how quickly you want to finish. This is like, the mediation chain constructor is constructing these things. Maybe they have some time constraints on, like, maybe you have a feeling that, from here to here, if I'm going to ask AdMob at $94.99, they're going to reject it. So let's proceed quickly instead of wasting time here, right? I mean,
personalized reserve prices, right?
No, but these are different providers, right? So just because AppLovin turned down $100 doesn't mean the fan and AdMob will turn down.
Absolutely, there is no reason for that, but still, you could still imagine that, like, I'm going to waste time by doing this. But anyway, like, the service providers, they do it anyway. Right? That's the interesting part here. If it is all like parallel, it'll be exactly a Dutch auction, which is what I'm getting to in the next slide. Meaning, if it is all like 100 for everybody, and then everybody is getting called at 99, everybody is getting called at 98. That's like a Dutch auction, which is not the case here. It's like a non-transparent Dutch auction case. Yeah. Okay. So, how is multi-call implemented? Well, the publishers are altering easily spoofable attributes of a query. Like there's something called an ad slot code, which nobody knows what exactly it means, but for different requests you can change it. And now you don't know whether it's part of the same multi-call query or whether it's genuinely a different query. Okay, there are some techniques to decide it, but it's not like 100% foolproof. Like maybe it's genuinely two different queries which look very, very close to one another. So detection in buy side is hard. Okay, it's really hard to say whether the same ad unit is being resold or not, same physical ad unit.
So
okay.
All seems to be happen like less than like very small amount of time. Everything is online, correct?
Yeah, but still, like each of these guys is running an auction, right? Like I'm going to talk about the time. Like basically, app loving is going to call all these, and then they have to run their internal auction, presumably.
So how long does it take from the
Like for instance, like, sometimes each of these guys, like each node could take up around 500 milliseconds.
Okay. But still, I mean, soon you will decide, essentially. Less than
Yeah, I mean, it should, it should, yes. But still, if you think about like a single call, like we are talking about 200 to 300 milliseconds for desktop, because you have to, otherwise the experience is bad. For app, it's better. Okay, what are the consequences? Well, several bad consequences. One is that there's a huge increase in resource cost, because many big ad networks like Google Display Network, for instance, they are running their internal auctions because they're representing thousands of advertisers. And now for each query in the multi-call sequence, they have to run a separate auction, right, deciding who has to win, etc. And retrieving the right ad from a huge number of ads is really expensive. Like, it's all sharded across numerous machines. You have to go and get back. Like, it's a pretty non-trivial problem. Okay, and the more it becomes, like, the system will eventually melt after some point. Like, if you're multi-calling excessively. Secondly, advertiser ROI suffers. That should be obvious thing, because multi-call is trying to extract full surplus from advertisers, right? And if you think really that this query is not going to come back, maybe because you're naive or you don't really understand how this works, then you think, okay, $90 he is selling, and my value is 95. Perhaps I have to, accept it at this point, rather than like waiting because it's going to come back to me at 85 tomorrow, right? Which may be the right thing to do if you know that what's going on. Okay, so the high-level question is how to solve the multi-call problem. Practical, like this is happening today, and yeah.
So can I make sure I understand? So you seem to think that this multi-call is going to extract surplus from the advertisers to the seller, but isn't it that shouldn't you expect that advertisers will kind of like understand this and so shape the views? So
no, that is the question. So basically, how to do it is the question. I'm going to come to that. Like basically, if you don't, like if you, for instance, didn't know that multi-call is happening, for instance, or you couldn't detect, it's very hard to detect actually, right? Detecting is a non-trivial problem.
So you're saying that actually the advertisers typically do not know whether or not the multi-call is being done?
Either that, or basically now it is like common, but even if they know it, it's very hard to know like at what price you're going to get called next, right? If you and all your competitors are going to get called at similar prices together, that's at least okay. It's a Dutch auction, okay.
Right.
But it's not like that, right? Because this guy, fan got called at 95, and AdMob got called at 90, and so on, right? So
when you say solve, you're thinking of it from a single ad network point of view.
I'm thinking of it. Yeah, basically that is practically solving the problem from an ad network's point of view, both in terms of this terrible resource cost wastage and in terms of ROI, which is what the ad network exists to provide for its clients, which is advertisers. Okay, so
you don't, like when you know that you haven't met the reserve, you don't know what the largest bid was. Like that's never reported. Because I was thinking in your example, you went back to the network at a lower reserve.
yeah.
In the first round, that lower reserve had already been met. You should.
If the first round the reserve was met, that's it, right? The chain stops.
The lower reserve. Like you kind of know when you go back to fan, you know how much the reserve is going to go down by.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like you should never go down if you knew that.
Okay, so here you're saying that for 99.99, like fan is going to return an ad, return a bid at 80, let's say.
Say 95.
95, okay.
Next time you're going there at 85.
You're saying they won't do this call?
Yeah. Would it, like, could you not sort of anticipate that?
But that will be like bid caching, right? You're caching the bid for a different query, and then you're explicitly saying that I'm going to use it for a different query, because you are, after all, telling it's like a different query, right? You're changing the attributes. Who knows? I won't, like this ad slot code is too important for me. That's a scandal, actually. It's a scandal, and then like so many networks have reported about this bid caching. You report some bid, I'll store it, freeze it, and then use it for another query, okay? So that's problematic. But anyway, like the bid itself might not come here because fan looks at this reserve price and then like says I won't bid here because it's too much.
You don't want to reveal.
Yeah. But even if you do that, like it's a legal trouble. Like, okay, so initial thought is, why don't you like prevent multi-call with strict policy enforcement, right? One is that like that ship has sailed. Okay, this is like multi-call is there to exist, and then like publishers think of it as a way to get better money, etc. And this ad network, which is pushing for completely like enforcing very low number of multi-calls, will become less popular to the publisher, and therefore will have less access to the inventory. Maybe they'll put you in the last of the chain or something. Second is it's also hard to enforce because how are you going to, like, maybe you can detect it for your own sake, like you're 80% sure, but you have to present it to them like that really it was a part of the same ad unit that got sold and so on. Okay, so is this a Dutch auction? Right? It's not quite a Dutch auction. So basically the point here was that instead of these kind of policy things, there is, we need to think about game theoretic solutions for this, some incentives-based solutions from the ad network's point of view. So if it were a Dutch auction, that would be nice, but the real problem here is it's a non-transparent Dutch auction, right? You really don't know like what prices you are skipping. Your competitors got called at some price, you're skipping some other prices, right? And you thought like maybe if it's a pure Dutch auction, like P dollars, buying it at P is a good thing, but you never got called at P and your competitor got called at P, they want it at P and then you're waiting, that's how this problem. Okay, that's bad. Okay, which is, this example just captures this point. This is clear, right? Okay, so so how do you like solve the multi-call problem, right? Like how do you analyze it, for instance? There's also, the first question is the detection question. How do you detect multi-call? This is mostly an engineering task, but there are some modeling issues too here, like how close are the prices in the successive calls? The time intervals between two calls. There could also be like intertwining, like, the two genuinely different queries and they are both intertwining. Like, one called at 100, other called at 90, and then one is going down. Like, so it's very difficult, even if you have logs information, to detect it. So it's a practical problem. But anyway, like for game theory wise, is there anything like a multi-call equilibrium, like if it exists at all, which is basically everyone is somehow best responding. The multi-call chain constructor, whose goal is to maximize revenue for the publisher, is doing some kind of non-transparent Dutch auction with this chain, and then each ad network knowing how other ad networks are like throttling their queries, which is basically saying, hey, this 90 is a bogus, I'm going to wait for an 80, right? If you know that the other ad networks are going to behave like this, what would you do? Like what is like the equilibrium of the system? And so let's say you assume 100% multi-call detection. You really know that this particular thing is going to come back again, like it's a part of the same chain. Or what if you're only able to say that this is basically the only probability P that this is part of a multi-call? Maybe like you think this is like some genuinely another thing which won't come again later or something. Okay, so how would you think about it? I think that's the practical question here, which can be formalized in.
Even it's more complication actually. These guys, this is like the New York Times or something, they may use this multi-call, and if they don't get anything after some level, they may actually go and participate even in Google Ad Exchange themselves. So that's another level that they may, after this, if they are not successful, they may go and participate in some other.
Yeah, they could send a call, like that's up to them. They basically can go to any extent. Usually, the chain length is like 50 or something, that's at least like some informal estimates, but they have to stop at some point because even for apps, there is a time, right? Like, okay, so these are basically the questions here, like how do you analyze this non-transparent Dutch auction, make any modeling assumptions you want. There are different ways to do this, and then think about like what happens to the equilibrium. Is this a good is this a good outcome, right? Where ad networks don't melt themselves or burn themselves by repeatedly running these very expensive internal auctions themselves for each call in the multi-call.
Just a quick comment. The one aspect of this problem is analyzing economics as a durable goods monopoly. So where you are going to set a price for a good, and the buyers have incentives to wait until you lower the price.
Mm-hmm.
Big literature in economics, which
like cost conjecture and durable goods monopoly, where you're competing with your own future prices, right? Yeah. But okay, so in this case, if you don't know what your competitors are going to do, what does it say? Like, if you're a ad network and you don't know like how your competitors are going to respond, for instance, maybe one of them is really aggressive because they have a lot of budget, they want to spend it soon. In this chain, like, yes, I know that the price is going to go down, but, one of the networks is aggressive and that they're going to get it and you don't know how aggressive they are. Anyway, yeah, okay.
So it's not just this one query that you care about, right? So the other queries also.
Yeah, which have like different chains constructed for them, different links.
Some kind of matching or budget constraint for the advertiser?
Let's forget about budget constraints for now. Like usually it's always a question of like they want to spend everything, and sometimes they're like these ad networks are aggressively spending money, usually on that side. That if you're left with money on the table, that's problematic, like, because the advertisers want to.
But it's a constraint, right?
It's still a constraint. I'm saying it's not. Okay. Yes, there exists some budget constraint, like, but that's not the first order thing. If you want to model this, you can like. It's not necessary to worry about it.
So you can think of just a single query in isolation and not have to worry about it.
Yes, if like we can solve that problem, for instance, that would be very nice. Like if you analyze a single query in isolation and solve this, is interesting.
Do you know if people are shading their bids if they know that multicall exists? Like, are there like two platforms, one which uses multicall, one which doesn't? Do you know if there's a quantitative difference in bidding behavior?
It's very hard to say that, right? Like, how do you like? What does it mean? Because each query is different. There is like a whole vector of features for this query, and then the next query is different, and there's a time of the day, and like, so I don't know what it means to figure out that they really shaded because of this. But definitely, like, since this is a common phenomenon, these sophisticated ad networks will shade. There's no question about that.
But I mean,
Unless they are aggressively, like, they want to win it very soon, they want to spend all the budget. That behavior is also there. There is some irrationality effect to that.
But I mean, the shading happens in each of these ad networks, correct?
Yes. They are responsible for shading.
People who are doing that, they are doing a bit shading.
They are responsible for doing that, but from what I've heard, like many of them, like they think about like bidding very differently than in game theoretic terms. They are thinking about like how to spend all this money, because if some money is left on the table, that's like a big deal, because they really, for advertisers, reach is maximum. Why need to reach? But, okay.
Do we know what algorithms mediators are using to decrease the resale prices?
No, certainly not. Yeah.
Just like
We have to model it ourselves.
decreasing?
Usually it's decreasing. Yeah. Like, there are some occasional weird cases where it increases, but again, we are not sure, right? We are just like positing that these are the chains, and for the most part, it's decreasing. So I think that's a reasonable assumption. That part we can assume reasonably well.
So in terms of potential reasons this is a problem, like you're calling it the multicall problem, the reason it's a problem is that the allocation is inefficient, or that there's a lot of wasted energy in running all of these auctions, or do you view those as kind of on comparable scales, or is one of these a much bigger concern to you than others?
I think both are problematic. Like this resource wastage is a big problem, particularly the bigger the ad network is. For the same ad unit, you're spending a lot of money. But the advertiser ROI is also reasonably important, right? Because ultimately, like, these ad networks represent their clients this way, so and they're going to look for ROI.
So is there like good evidence on kind of the cost of running these auctions relative to, say, the surplus available to advertisers through them?
Well, the evidence is you can just look at these chains and ask how often did an advertiser clear at the top of the chain, and the same like ad network clear later in the chain, and for similar looking queries, for instance, right? Where presumably they have the same value, and then ask like if most of the clearance is happening early on in the chain, but for the same query they've also cleared later with a non-mediation provider at a much lower reserve price, then perhaps then that they got ripped off here or something. Meaning like they could have like easily gotten a much higher surplus,
like I guess
without this, right?
Costs of running these auctions. I just assume electricity is cheap, but I also know that the cost of an individual impression may not be that high. So I don't have a good way of like,
electricity. No, because you're talking about tens of thousands of advertisers who are sharded in different machines, and I have to retrieve all of them and run. It's not cheap. So what do you mean by electricity is cheap?
I mean, we're taking a very small number and multiplying it by a very big number, and I don't have a sense of like whether it's a negligible quantity in the end, or whether it's like.
So the display ads marketplace itself is like only barely profit making, right? Because of all the costs. Ad server itself is like a huge, hugely costly operation. And if you add like burdens like this on top of it, it becomes problematic.
Okay, so that's the claim.
Yes. For platforms, like running ad server, like is a very costly operation. Okay. So the next is, you might have heard or read about this, that many exchanges have moved to first price auctions. and Google's AdX also will be doing soon. So how should we think about reserve pricing in first price auctions? What does it even mean? So first of all, why reserve price, right? Well, the problem is that as targeting technologies get better and better, auctions have become quite thin. Okay, so you have very few participants in the auction, and if auctions are thin, then competition alone is not enough to drive revenue.
Basic question: why first price?
Okay, so there are numerous reasons for it, but practically speaking, like advertisers want transparency. That is, I pay what I bid. Because there were like numerous unscrupulous exchanges out there which claimed that they were running second price auction, but then they were doing all sorts of things. Like there are some soft floors where, like, there's a soft floor, meaning that if you clear the floor, you pay that floor. But even if you don't clear that floor, you will continue to win the auction but pay the first price bid. And then there's a hard floor. Once you clear that, once you fall below that, you get filtered. So they call it a second price auction, but nobody will give it in writing that this is it, right? So there is something like a first price auction. It's a convex combination of first and second price. Who knows what is going on, right? Because I pay, I never know what I'm going to be paying once I bid this. In a first price auction, although there is the burden shifted to me in terms of strategizing, second price auction is strategically trivial. First price auction, there's some strategy involved. At the very least, I know that I'm going to pay what I bid. So there is this transparency there. And there was a big call for this because of all these practices, and exchange after exchange started moving to this. Okay. So why do you want a reserve price? You want a reserve price because competition is just not enough to give good yield for publishers. And often the difference between the highest and the second highest bid is huge. Okay, it's not uncommon to have this difference to be larger than the second highest bid itself. The discount is huge. So you need to put a reserve price in between.
Which auction are you talking about?
This is the display ad auctions.
But about like Google search, essentially, do you see the same things there as well?
The Google search is a completely different marketplace, right? There is not this, for answering that question, for instance, there's all this unscrupulous competition I was talking about, that landscape which pressured like this change to first price auction and transparency and so on, right? Google search is a completely different landscape. We don't have that kind of problems where there's like numerous exchanges running whatever. So this is all for, none of this is for search, this is all for display ads. Okay, so reserve pricing. So in reserve pricing in second price auctions is simple, right? You have n buyers with values like this, and suppose you manage to put a reserve price between V1 and V2, then you increase the seller's revenue by R minus V2, but crucially without needing any buyer reaction, right? The previous query, they reacted like this, and then they bid like this. The next query, for a similar looking query, I put this reserve price. Then without any reaction, you're still making this money. But in a first price auction, let's say buyers are bidding like this, and you manage to luckily find a reserve price in between these two, which is hard, because obviously reserve price is sent before the bids, right? You're sending it in a call out. Even if you luckily happen to find this thing, it's a no-op, right? Because they're going to pay their bid. The highest guy is going to pay B1. But in reality, it's revenue negative, because if R happens to be larger than B1, you're killing the query. So trivially, reserve pricing in first price auction is revenue negative. So what are you hoping? The only thing you could hope for is that buyers are reacting to reserve prices, right? Reacting to reserve prices and changing their bids in response to that, because anyway they're doing some shading. Originally they were not bidding properly, but then now with this reserve price, perhaps they will raise their bid. That's the hope. But then there is a long-term versus short-term buyer response. Short-term means instantaneously when I send a reserve price, they're going to respond to that in the bid that you're sending me. That is, think of two bids, two call-outs. In one call-out, the reserve price is 0. In another call-out to the same advertiser, same query, I'm sending a reserve price which is non-zero. Perhaps they'll change their bid in response to this. Right. If they do that, that is good. If they don't do that, they're just updating their bidding models on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis, seeing like how they are performing on the KPIs, right? Then that's a long-term question. Now, the A/B test, which is the gold standard for making decisions in all big companies, will completely fail to capture the long-term effect. It will only capture the short-term reaction, right? Because you have this treatment effect. You're treating some advertisers and you're asking like, hey, what happened? And if they didn't react in short term, always your A/B test is going to show that reserve pricing is revenue negative. Okay, so measuring the long-term effect itself is a non-trivial problem, and there are beautiful causal inference questions here, right? So first is, we need to treat advertisers, not queries, right? Advertisers are our experimental units here to see what they're doing, but we can only treat queries, obviously. You set reserve price on queries. Now, if you treat a random fraction of queries, then an advertiser might only see a fraction of their queries affected, and they're not going to change their bidding behavior, and what you're measuring is not what you're supposed to measure. On the other hand, so then what do we need here? Well, there's a common assumption in causal inference called SUTVA, which is stable unit treatment value assumption, which says that the outcome of a treatment unit is independent of how other units are treated, which fails here, right? Which means in the presence of interference, there is interference effect between different queries or different experimental units. You need some kind of balanced partitioning of the graph on experimental units to do this, right? Of course, there's an NP-hard problem in balanced partitioning. You can only approximately minimize the interference. You cannot always eliminate it. And even the problem of if I give you two partitions of a graph, deciding which partition you should pick, which is going to give a more unbiased, is already non-trivial. There was a paper recently on this. Okay. So there are definitely some nice questions to be answered here, like how to set up this long-term experiment and how are you going to measure the long-term effects of the surprise. There are further complications to this, which is, I keep saying advertisers, but it's not really advertisers, it's ad networks on this side, and each ad network is representing multiple advertisers, which adds to the complication of this treatment effect that I was talking about. So this is again a very current problem. It's far from solved. Even practically speaking, there's no solution. The other is providing bidding tools for advertisers in first price auctions, because many ad networks are still not ready to bid in a first price auction. Okay. So in these cases, ad exchanges are providing bid translation services. They say, I know only how to bid in a second price auction. So ad networks say that I'll provide this translation service and this is how it works. So the same exchange will have some ad networks participating in second price auction and the others participating in first price. What does it mean? For all those who have opted to participate in the second price, we'll run a second price auction. And then the winner of the second price auction will participate in a first price auction with the rest. And then we will provide a bid translation service where we will take the clearing price, the highest price and the second highest, and then translate it to a bid to participate in the first price auction. How do you do it? Right? So the initial simple solution is you just forward the clearing price in the second price auction. Well, this is bad because it often could be too low. Okay, like particularly given what I said before, that there could be huge difference between first and second highest, this guy won't be winning anything in the first price auction. Or you could send the true high, the value itself, but then they are part of what's the whole point of bid translation. Like if you send the true value, you're bidding too high in the auction, that's going to cause loss of surplus. So the goal is to protect advertiser surplus in these bid translation services, but also to be like you should not eat up too much into publisher revenue because they themselves are barely floating. Like most publishers really need this money also, and advertisers are aware of this. Okay. So the other is other kind of bidding tool is like providing a bidding dashboard. Okay, so can we provide some kind of a bidding dashboard to guide the buyers to a good equilibrium? Right? There was like a paper in the CC called Dashboard Mechanisms. So this is not too far-fetched actually, because Google itself, for instance, in AdWords, we provide like some kind of dashboard which gives a landscape information of this is your cost versus like what you can win. If you pay this much, you can win this much, right? So there's a landscape like this given, and then buyers respond to that landscape somehow. I don't know how, like they use it somehow. But the main idea here in this paper, at least, is that agents are unable to arrive at equilibrium, but they are at least able to best respond to the dashboard, right? If I give you this dashboard and I tell you that I'm going to implement what I promised in the dashboard, you can at least best respond to that.
What's a dashboard?
A dashboard is basically a landscape like this, right? I'm going to give you this. This is basically the dashboard. I'll give you a whole curve like this. If you spend this much, then you'll get these many impressions. If you spend that much, you'll get those many impressions, like a cost versus a probability of allocation curve. So you need not worry about competition or anything. Somehow, all that has been rolled into this dashboard, and you trust that the publisher or the dashboard provider knows better, and they will give this. They will, they will be consistent to what they reported, and therefore you best respond given the dashboard rather than best responding to any, best responding in equilibrium, for instance, which is hard to get it and so on.
So it's kind of, you're trying to give a simulation tool, but it's not like you're thinking that one advertiser, is not dependent on anyone else. That dashboard itself will change during the auction process, right?
Yeah. So initially, okay, so let's think of initially you don't know anything as a publisher or the dashboard provider, like all the value, like say private values and prior free, you don't have any price, nothing. Okay, so initially your dashboard is complete bullshit because like you can't give anything, but slowly it will get better, assuming either persistent values, which is what they do in this paper for the most part, or if values change across time, then maybe you should have like clever ways of slowly changing values. This is also like reasonable because you're talking about like similar queries at least in the given sequence, right? Long-lived agents. What can you do? So those are some interesting things which are not actually tackled properly in that paper. Like if values change slowly, but you still want to provide dashboard consistency, which is what you were getting at, which is how can you be like, you promise something, but you have to deliver what you promised, right? Otherwise they won't be best responding. Even then there is a question of like, they didn't give what they promised, but it was still not too far. In that case, perhaps it's still better to best respond to the dashboard rather than doing something on your own because, yeah, there's still value in that. Second is like, this is to what extent can you tolerate value change? How much value change can you tolerate as a dashboard provider over time? I think there are some interesting questions here, nice follow-ups to this. I think that's it.
I think you should wait for Shah, but do the questions first.
Yeah, so we have time for a few more questions.
Yes, I have a question on the search ad versus display ad. So you said that the display ad is more moving towards first price option, but the search ad is still fine with second price. What are the properties of the display ad which is kind of pushing it towards first price?
The marketplace is very different, right? Because there are so many exchanges running these auctions, and certainly like Google or Facebook, or these are the only things. There are so many exchanges providing these services, and each one has their own way of doing things, which is unlike the search landscape. And therefore, there are some trust issues here, which is one of the biggest drivers in doing this. And another big difference is there is real-time bidding in display ads, which is not the case in search ads. It's like another big difference.
No, I think lots of others actually already went to first price.
They have all, yes, that's true.
Someone Google was the last person, like not last, but one of them.
Yeah. So. Yes, but these others went to first price because of these kinds of things. Because anyway they were doing something like a first price. At least now they announced that it's a first price, so at least there's full transparency.
And in a sense, the search also is doing that as well.
No.
Like the reserve price is playing. Reserve price playing a very important role in search as well.
Reserve price is not first price, right?
No, but the same thing that you mentioned, because when you put the reserve price high enough, essentially, and then you put soft flooring, essentially you are making it first.
Yes, but that is soft flooring, right? I put a reserve price completely independent of anything and then wait for you to respond. That's fine, right? If I pay reserve price properly, it's not first pricing. It's still full truthful and.
It's a soft floor that's again very.
Yes, soft flooring is different. That is the bad practice, right? And that is why these exchanges which are doing this, and because Google is bidding in many of these. Google bids, there are Google buyers who bid in other networks also, other exchanges also. You can measure these things, and you can see the soft floors pretty clearly.
So what is soft flooring?
It's nothing. There are two floors. The soft floor is a higher floor, and there is a hard floor. If you are higher than the soft floor, let's say you're the only bidder, which is like a thin auction, right? You're the only. Two reserve prices. If you're higher than the soft floor, you pay the soft floor. If you're between the soft and the hard floor, you pay your bid itself. If you're below the soft floor, you filter the query.
So in the dashboard idea, so I wonder if the platforms may have incentives to not to be truthful here. If let's say the platform wants to make the bid higher, then they will have incentive to sort of inflate the possibility of getting an ad when the other one is a bit higher. More than actually Indica is. Is there any way to sort of incentivize the platform, tie the hand in some way? Because it sounded like in the display ads, the incentive problem or the by the platform is a problem here. So.
So okay. So.
Discussion of the second first price auction, the transparency is kind of very important here. So.
I don't know what is the transparency issue with the dashboard, right? Because once you provide a dashboard and you're you're going to be held, somebody's going to ask whether you're consistent or not. That's transparent, right?
Right. Is it easy for the advertisers to be to see whether this?
On an aggregate fashion, it's not too hard.
I mean, given the dashboard, the advertiser can compute the payment. If the final payment doesn't match that, that means the advertiser.
Oh yeah, sure. But what I mean is that if I understand correctly, the dashboard shows the curve telling you, a relationship between the bidding price and the probability of winning, right? So.
Yes, which is probability of winning. You should think of it as total number of impressions, right? So at the end of the day, you go and count you have good reportings. You're an advertiser who's an ad network is providing nice reporting to you. You go and see whether really it matched up, right?
Okay, so these advertisers are repeated bidders and
yeah, they can it's. I don't think transparency is a big issue here, but really providing a dashboard where you can be consistent in spite of value changes and so on, instead of making just the trivial assumption that values are persistent across time. How to tackle general single parameter? I mean, although we're talking about one-item auctions and these things, I think theoretically speaking, think about general single parameter settings. What will happen? Then those are interesting questions.
Fortunately, we have lunch break after this, so you can continue the discussion during lunch break. So thanks.
Before we disperse, so Shafi Goldwasser, who's the director of